It's preparing right now,
Okay.
but it's saying it's streaming live.
Okay. Hey everyone, welcome to the Global STEMPeers conference. This is the first ever virtual STEMPeers conference that we are hosting. Our counterparts in Europe held it in earlier this year, and when it was time for us to hold again in US, we realized that times have changed and we have to change the format, and that's why we made a little bit of change to the format to our US STEMPeers conference. Of course, we expanded it. We know that we have members across the globe, and they are always excited about hosting and viewing this conference, what happens in this conference. So the fourth edition of this conference in US is happening live on YouTube, and we welcome all of you uh, to this meeting. And I will give a little bit of introductions for those who are not aware of STEMPeers or have heard little about STEMPeers. And after that, I'll pass over the microphone to Marcus, who is our keynote speaker today. And of course, I should also introduce Shohini, who is heading the organizing team, and she was the brains behind getting everybody together and starting the whole thing. And now we are here on the final day. So thank you, Shohini, for heading the team.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity to do this.
Absolutely. Give me a moment.
Sure.
Can you see my slide? Okay, so STEMPeers. This is the first flyer that came out, and of course, this is the "Life is a Journey, so is Science," the slogan that this wonderful organizing team came up with. And of course, we're going to in the next 4 days or the next 2 weekends, we will be talking about how life is in STEM and how the career shapes up and what are the challenges and how things can change as we proceed in the career path. So talking about STEMPeers, our organization started as a Facebook group way back in 2015. And ever since then, it has been a social media driven, interactive and advisory platform for STEM trainees and professionals. And in brief, what happens in this community is networking, empowerment, support, enhancement of creativity of its members, and as well as education on various issues that support the career, support the science, and support research, as well as careers exploration purposes. What we do over here is peer-sourced mentorship development and skill development. And how we do it is that we have created multiple programs across the board that enhance the skills and provide mentorship. The mentorship program from Gurukul advises a lot of candidates in their career exploration strategies, interviews, CV writing, LinkedIn profile. So our executive coach Tracy heads that program along with several board members of our group, as well as a lot of volunteers who spend a lot of time to talk to the community members and help them in their career transitions. We also have a very robust science communication program in our organization. Club Sarai, our oldest SciComm program, started in 2016, is a blog which was recently featured in Genetic Society of America as one of the major SciComm resources. We have a very strong following in Instagram through our STEM Times channel, which is our SciComm Instagram, which, of course, if you visit that page, it is full of scientific delight of pictures, as well as a lot of information that STEM trainees or young kids who are interested in STEM will get a lot of inspiration and knowledge from. Then we have our newsletters, which are a variety of flavors. We have a bi-weekly newsletter which talks about the happenings in our community, as well as a lot of other new stuff happening around the world. Then we have Met This newsletter, which talks about the pharma and biotech updates for all our professionals who are strongly interested in the business of life science. And then we have the editor's choice, which is a weekly update on the best happening research papers across the world. After that, we have two major conferences which happen in US and in Europe, and they are the annual conference. One of this, which we are witnessing today, is happening from the US soil. Of course, it is a global conference. And then we have the Euro STEMPeers conference, which happens in out of Europe for networking purposes and to make for the confluence of ideas too. We also generated STEMPeers fellowships 2 years ago, and that was because of the generous donations from the STEMPeers community, that we are providing monetary support to candidates who want to attend conferences or want to join a course, or simply want to develop skills which are never funded by any of their conventional STEM training programs as postdocs or grad students. Then we have local chapters, of course, which are all over the world, and they really are in-person support group for people who are moving from one place to another for their STEM career and want to make friends in their local communities. So with such a vibrant group, you can really keep on talking, but I would keep it there. But at the same time, what is important to mention is that along these 5 years of our existence, we have made several collaborations. Some of them I'm highlighting today. I'm sorry if I am not highlighting some of the other collaborations, but there are tons of it. And we are proud of these collaborations and very thankful that they came together and joined hands with us in promoting our cause. And we are proud to promote their cause as well. With that, I wanted to say that STEMPeers has created a global global handprint. Sorry, I said footprint. We call it a handprint and not a footprint, is because everything that happens in STEMPeers is over the tap of fingers on your mobile phone or on your computer, and that's how the huge group of volunteers of STEMPeers works. And because of this, we have created a global network within ourselves. And this network was recognized by Nature Biotechnology as one of the biggest STEM community network in the world. And we are named featured in next to some of the major educational institutions across the world in June this year. So it was a proud moment for our community, and we really thank everyone who stayed with us for making this community look the way it is. But as you know, when it was time to plan our in-person conference in the US, the world changed, and everybody went behind a mask, and all our network went into a box. So we thought that we have to, when we plan this conference, we have to take a different approach. We took a 3R approach. That is, we rethought, we reimagined, and we reinvented the whole concept. We rethought that does STEM career path always have to start at the graduate or postgraduate level, because we know people get inspired to become a STEM professional even at undergraduate level. And we reimagined it because we have to continue empowering the early STEM career trainees, and they should be aware of the strategies at a very early stage. It should not always be at a very late stage at a postdoc or at the late stage grad student situation, which of course our community has benefited, but we need to do better. And of course we have to reinvent, because most of the STEMPeers conferences have been geographically restricted till last year, but this time we wanted that whatever discussions happen should happen to benefit our members across the globe. And that is where our global STEMPeers team got together, and with the objectives of bringing the trainees and experts on the same platform to create the possibility of sharing diverse perspectives and learning from the success stories to ensure course correction. Of course, we are enabling collaborative mentorship through this conference. You will see in the next 4 days, and we were leveraging the power of social media. So we are reaching out to all the STEMPeers across the globe. And of course, we are making conscious efforts to create a sensible and healthy STEM workforce for the future. So as a result, you can see this amazing team of organizers have put together a very beautiful conference, which will start right away, where you will see the undergraduate session at 11 a.m. today and then followed by graduate session tomorrow. And the next weekend we'll have postdoc sessions back to back, and finally we will have the work-life balance session, which will be headed by Tracy next week itself. So with that, I come to our keynote speaker, who is Dr. Marcus Lambert. Dr. Lambert is an assistant dean in the Weill Cornell Graduate School of Medicine and an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine. Dr. Lambert co-directs the Office of Student Diversity at Weill Cornell Medicine, which serves over 400 medical students and more than 900 graduate students. Trained in both medical and social science research methodology, his research efforts focus on educational and health equity interventions that improve access, equity, and diversity in science and medicine. He is currently the director in an NIH-funded R25 grant to support diversity in biomedical sciences, director of a summer research program for undergraduate students, and is a member of the Cornell Center for Health Equity. He has been invited as a guest lecturer in institutions such as the Fred Hutch, Georgetown University, the Jackson Labs, and he received his PhD in biomedical science from NYU and his bachelor's from Howard University. He also holds a master's degree in clinical epidemiology and health services research from Weill Cornell Graduate School. And we are extremely proud to host him today, where he will talk about unconscious bias in STEM. So without much talk, I will hand it over to Marcus.
Thanks so much, Abby. I appreciate it. It's really an honor to be invited to sort of help kick off the STEMPeers conference. You guys are doing amazing work. It's just really, really, really phenomenal. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everyone can see those slides, correct? So again, you know, it's a real true honor to be here. I hope that I appreciate, you know, the honor to even be able to talk about this topic of unconscious bias in STEM careers. You know, I've been working. Well, I probably have been working in diversity all my life because of my sort of lived experience, but I've been working on the professional side, I think, for the past 7 years, where I've actually been closely studying and diving into aspects of diversity and inclusion, you know, as a director of diversity, as a STEM sort of administrator, but also as an assistant dean, more recently as an assistant dean of diversity and student life. And I've given a number of talks, you know, around the United States. You know, I've been listening really to a lot of different experiences. So I like to think that I've seen a quite, you know, international and global view on things, even outside of the United States. I've talked with others from around the world. And I hope to just be able to present some of those concepts that are not only in the diversity literature, but that I've learned as well, and that I've been actually researching. So half of my talk is really going to expose, I think, us to, starting off in some sense, the basics of unconscious bias, but then I'll dive a little bit into what I've learned in my research, and hopefully, you know, we can find some benefit. I look forward to if there's an opportunity for some questions at the end of the talk. If you find anything relevant, feel free to tweet it out. You can find me on Twitter, Marcus_PhD. But let's dive right in. I want everyone to first take a moment, close your eyes, and I want you to visualize as I read out this sort of story. Imagine that you have tickets to attend a groundbreaking ceremony for one of the richest commercial real estate projects in New York City. When you arrive, the builder of that real estate project greets you, thanks you for coming. Later on that evening, you have reservations for one of the hottest restaurants in town. You notice at the table next to you that there's a couple who happens to be celebrating their wedding anniversary. You think, oh, that's really so sweet, right? It's been an expensive evening, so you decide to call an Uber pool. This is pre-pandemic, an Uber pool to share your ride home. Your co-rider shares with you that they just became the CEO of the latest tech startup. Now open your eyes. I want to ask you a few questions. You know, one of the things that you sometimes think about in your mind, you know, you sort of picture some things that sometimes are familiar to you. In that sort of first scenario or that first bullet point, did you happen to think about the builder of that real estate project as being identifying as Black or Latino? When you viewed the couple next to you that were celebrating their wedding anniversary, were they two males or two females? And when you shared that co-rider that you shared with the Uber pool, did that person happen to be a woman or happen to be identify as female, as being the CEO of this tech startup? And maybe, you know, your answers to those questions might have been yes, and maybe they might have been no. But that's just one thing that I want us to sort of think about, is the sort of natural assumptions that might come to our minds when we think about scenarios like this. This is often sort of given in, you know, diversity trainings and at TED Talks, these sort of scenarios to get us to think about the sort of immediate assumptions that might come to our minds. And, you know, it really points to this concept of bias, right? And just if you start at the very basic level, what is bias? Bias is this prejudice that's sometimes in favor of or against one thing or person or group compared to another. That's usually in a way considered to be unfair. You know, I have 4 kids at home. I often think about, on Fridays, we have movie nights, and we often give them, you know, little snacks. We'll divide up some chips or something into little baggies. I dare not give one of my children more chips than the other. They'll cry out, "Dad, that's so unfair," right? We can't, you know, this is this idea, this bias, right? That you can give someone, not necessarily give someone, but just someone has something that seems unfair to someone else. But sometimes it can be a conscious bias. Like, you know, I consciously give one kid more ice cream than the other. Maybe they deserved a little bit better because of their behavior or something. Or maybe it's unconscious, maybe it's by accident. And trust me, with kids, they count each one of those chips or each scoop of ice cream. So, you know, but in our everyday experiences, we have these sort of conscious biases and unconscious biases. Unconscious biases sometimes are also known as implicit biases. And, you know, so sometimes biases may be held, you know, by an individual or group or an institution, and it can have negative or positive consequences. I want us to consider something else. Let's take a look at these pictures. We'll take a moment for you to just look, observe, think about each one of these pictures. Think about what may be assumptions about some of these pictures or some of these individuals. Maybe they're not your assumptions. Maybe there just might be assumptions or maybe even stereotypes or things that you know, maybe ways society views these individuals. Think about what we know and what we can't know about a person when we actually look at them or see them. What can we sort of conclude? What can't we conclude? What are sort of obvious things to us and what are not obvious? I'm just going to reveal a few facts about each of these images. Think about, were any of those sort of things surprising to you? And just think about the sort of deeper narrative that each one of these individuals has that we can't tell or that we don't know, right? And think about sometimes these particular individuals moving throughout society, moving throughout the world in their sort of professional or personal circumstances, and how they might be received or how they might be viewed. And think about sometimes the biases that these particular individuals may confront or may receive, right? Those are unconscious biases. And oftentimes those unconscious biases are associated with social stereotypes about certain groups of people that can form, you know, sometimes outside of your own conscious awareness. Oftentimes it happens usually in a sort of, you know, limited circumstance. Sometimes we have to make quick assumptions about someone, right? But we have to sort of pause, right? And think about, you know, are we sort of conforming to a social stereotype? And we have a tendency to do this. We have a tendency to sort of organize our social worlds by categorizing, right? Categorizing. Our brains are wired to make these sort of cognitive shortcuts to help us process millions and millions of pieces of information that we receive almost every second. A sort of test, you know, what percentage, take a moment to think, what percentage do you think are our decisions are made by in terms of our conscious minds? Experts believe that approximately what percent of our decisions are made by our unconscious minds? Well, the answer is 90%. Experts believe that about 90% of our decisions are made by our unconscious minds, right? So if we're receiving all of this information, you know, it's not just in a presentation here, I'm talking about, like, think of if you're driving a car, right? You know, many of us drive cars, right? Maybe I'm in New York City. I just sold my minivan, so I'm not driving anymore. But think about all of the things that you have to input when you're driving a car. And think about all of the things that are sort of unconscious, right? Things that you're not even sort of really thinking about. Many of us do it, you know, almost kind of in second nature, right? But all of these sort of inputs of, you know, other drivers, other cars coming your way, trees, you know, sun, stoplights, crosswalks, all of these things. I don't know if any of you have ever driven in a sort of country outside of, you know, your own sort of home country, like myself. You know, sometimes you'll see in certain countries that no stoplights, you come to an intersection and cars are going each which way, right? You are processing this all, in some sense, many of this unconsciously, right? So all of these decisions your brain is making, and think about this idea of a blind spot, right? A sort of decision that you can sort of make unconsciously, that's outside of your own conscious awareness, that ultimately might have a sort of positive or negative effect, not only on your behavior, but on a person or someone else that's receiving it. So we make these snap judgments, and sometimes we can be sort of, you know, wrong, or might not necessarily be in aligned even with our own conscious values and beliefs, right? If we believe and say we believe and respect and we want to treat certain people fairly, but sometimes our unconscious mind might work against that. And I hope everybody understands that concept. And I think most of us do. So the sort of point that I want to bring home is that by bringing our awareness to our unconscious minds, we can make decisions and take actions that are more aligned with our declared beliefs, right? We all have values and beliefs that we sort of, you know, take hold that are part of us, right? But we have to sort of be a little bit more conscious and aware of the decisions that we sometimes make. So what does the literature tell us? Let's go through some of the published studies. There was a study, I think in the early 2000s, that looked at names and how employable those names were. So fictitious resumes were sent to help wanted ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers. And the race, to manipulate the race of these particular resumes, they were randomly assigned either an African-American sounding or a white sounding name. You know, the African-American sounding name being Lakeisha and Jamal, the white sounding names being Emily, right? And I can't see my slide here, but another white sounding name. And these sort of white names received, if you could guess, what percentage would you think received more callbacks for interviews. It was 50%. So 50% of the white names, or the white names actually received 50% more callbacks for interviews. So callbacks are also more responsive to resume quality for white names than African-American ones. And this sort of racial gap is uniform across occupations and industries and employer sizes. And the authors also found little evidence that employers are inferring, sort of social class within the names. So this paper came out in 2004. What about other studies? Gender bias. So John versus Jennifer, right? So even within the sciences, we see examples of this sort of unconscious bias. There was a study, 2012, more recently, 127 science faculty, and these are from research-intensive institutions. They rated applications of students that were randomly assigned either a male-sounding name, John, or a female-sounding name, Jennifer, for a lab manager position. And the science faculty rated these applications. So again, exact same application. The only thing that's different is really the name that's put on that application, whether it's more of a female sounding name or male sounding name. And the lab managers that are for this lab manager position, the science faculty that were rating these students that applied for this position often rated the male applicants significantly more competent and significantly more hireable than the female sounding applicants. And what was also really interesting and shocking, they also selected a higher starting salary for these potential male applicants, even though the resume is the exact same, right? And offered more career mentoring to the male applicants. And you might think, well, maybe this is coming more from some of the male faculty versus the female faculty, but that was not the case. Gender of the faculty participants did not affect the responses. So whether you are a male faculty or female faculty, you were equally likely to exhibit bias against the female student. When that study came out, I think it was pretty interesting, pretty shocking. I want to give you some names to think about. Do these names affect your interpretation of their abilities or scientific competence? So I think many of us, especially being that we're in an unconscious bias symposium, are said, come on, Marcus, you can't get me that easily. None of these names I have any sort of bias against, right? But, the average sort of professor, does in this study. And this also came from 2012. Emails that were sent to about 6,500 randomly selected professors from 259 American universities. Again, this is in the States. Basically rated the Caucasian male sounding names as essentially being more responsive to those particular emails. So these emails either sort of requested a meeting that was within the same day, that Monday, or for the next week, the next Monday. And if it was a request for a meeting that was now or sort of, urgent that same day, we didn't really see much discrimination according to the study. However, if there was a request for a meeting in the future, say, next week, in this particular experiment, it was a week from, that day. So the next Monday, then there was a big sort of discrimination in the response. So again, this was from professors who students were inquiring, about a PhD program. And the only difference here was a change in the name, about 20 different names and 10 different race, gender categories. And when the requests were to meet 1 week later, Caucasian males were granted access to faculty members 26% more often than women or minority sounding names. And Caucasian males received more and faster responses. So again, a lot of times we think even sort of, as STEM professionals, as scientists, as engineers, that, oh, perhaps, we sort of see these biases, outside of our sort of discipline, but maybe not so much within the STEM field, but we also see it within our STEM fields as well. And, these are just some of the studies to sort of show that. So, what do we do about this? I've sort of established this sort of precedent. Yes, there are biases that exist. We have biases even within our own selves. Sort of, it doesn't matter, sometimes if you are, a male or even a minority, sometimes you have those biases as well. Or maybe you're underrepresented in your particular area. What do we do about it? So I'll start in the United States in the 1970s. The orchestras and a lot of the symphonies had figured this problem out some time ago, basically with blind auditions. They noticed that particularly in the top 5 orchestras in the United States, they had only 5% women, which was extremely problematic. I mean, I think even for the 1970s. So in the 70s and the 80s, orchestras began to use blind auditions. So the candidates would be situated on a stage behind a screen or behind a curtain to play for the jury that could not see them. And they would even take off their shoes, because sometimes the walk of the high heels would sometimes indicate to the jury that perhaps this might be, a female, applicant. So they were even instructed to take off their shoes. And essentially it created this sort of blind audition. And even if it was just for the sort of preliminary section or selection that would go on to the final round, the preliminary selection even had an effect. And researchers determined that this step alone made it 50% more likely that a woman would advance to the finals. So it was a way to sort of combat, blind, auditions. And, we might not in all of our spaces be able to sort of, blind our interviews, but I think it is a lesson learned. And it has had a sort of, big impact on orchestras. To date, I think they've attributed this particular model to the 20% or the rise of women being at the level of 20% for orchestras, even though I think there's still more to go. So how do we begin to sort of disrupt biases within our own spaces? If we have them, if we're receiving them, I think one of the important things that I've learned as a sort of administrator is to get the facts first. Sometimes we have this sort of tendency to create a narrative. Maybe we are experiencing a bias or a microaggression or witnessing, something that seems a little biased. Maybe it's unconscious on the part of, the perpetrator. So, I've seen plenty of times, working at an American university, a professor might be giving a class, might make a sort of off, hand comment that might be, let's say sexist or, allude to gender bias. And, it might take the students back a little bit. They might pause and say, wow, I'm a little shocked that the professor said that. Professor might have not even been aware that was something that was considered or received as sexist. And, maybe they were even, a lot of times, professors are well-intentioned. They'll bring up topics that they might think, will talk about that. As people, I think, especially now and nowadays are not, blind to these things, but it just might be perceived in a different way or might be perceived in a way that they don't intend for it to be perceived. So sometimes it's good to understand from other people's perspectives, what they were thinking, talk it out with them, understand what's going on, get the facts, right? I think in many of those cases, people are not, that's the difference between sort of explicit bias and implicit. They're not trying to be hurtful. And I think that's also where empathy comes in. Let's try to understand in some sense where the other person is coming from. What are their lived experience? What can you not know about them? What can you know about them more just beyond what you see than their sort of superficial, lens? You might, see me, for example, and you've heard my bio, but, there are aspects to me, there are aspects to all of us that are deeper and a part of our lived experience that you just can't tell by looking at someone, right? And you might be surprised. And that, I think, is where the empathy comes in. I think we have to take time to just really understand each other on a more than just a superficial level. If you're in a laboratory and you work with your colleagues, and you haven't sort of taken time to understand who that person is, what's their story, how did they get to where they are? That's, I think, time that we need to take to really be able to empathize with each other. And then I think we'll have a greater respect for each other. And it's not to say that we won't encounter biases, but we'll understand a little bit better about how to disrupt those biases. Micro affirmations, so I'm sure you've heard of the term microaggressions, these sort of repeated, behavioral, almost subtle sort of attacks, that might make you eventually, people often describe it as like almost little bee stings or something, that it's not enough to, it's not oftentimes a very sort of explicit bias or maybe a racism or discrimination, but these sort of subtle things that make you feel less than or, maybe unwelcome, right? You can combat that with micro affirmations, right? Take time to sort of acknowledge the presence of someone in a room, or, oh, thank you, Marcus, for that study that you did. Let's say you are a supervisor, right? And you have an opportunity to acknowledge the contribution of your staff members or your colleagues. And you don't even have to be a supervisor, but sometimes the power dynamics help. But just taking time to affirm the presence or the contribution of someone, right? These sort of micro affirmations, making people feel included and welcome and a part of that space. I think it goes a long way. Another thing is just thinking about, when we have to make important decisions, the sort of diversity that we take into account in those decisions, right? Do we have enough sort of women in the room? Do we have enough people representing different sort of perspectives and backgrounds and ages? All of that really helps to make the outcome much better. And I guarantee you there's a lot of actually published studies on that too, about this sort of diversity that leads to innovation. Sometimes, there was a famous study that, oftentimes you think sometimes the smartest people in the room, even though they might be homogeneous, they might all be alike, but they've been deemed as, smart or, higher grade point averages might come to a particular decision faster or better than another more diverse group. And that's not the case. The more diverse group usually outperforms the group that you think might be smarter, but more homogeneous. So, we have to be thinking about that and inputting those sort of practices in our day-to-day. If we're putting together a board or a committee, even a speaker's sort of list for the year, we want to make sure that we're capturing that sort of diversity, because it really helps in the decision-making. And then also taking a person-centered approach. I think oftentimes, again, we tend to put people in these sort of boxes of identities, like, oh, that person, even in our fields, right? Let's say that person is an engineer, that person is a, biomedical, cell biologist. I mean, science is come on now, even though we might be trained in that particular way, that person, just because they might be trained in an engineer, might think like, a physicist or something, and you might not even know their physics background. So I think, thinking about people as individuals more rather than the sort of box or identity that they might sort of identify with, right? Thinking about me as Marcus, not just as a male, or not just as, Black, or not just as American, thinking about the people and the person as an individual. That, again, helps to disrupt bias. And, I mentioned this idea of microaggressions, right? How do we, again, combat microaggressions? Let me be a little bit more specific, because microaggressions, I think, is oftentimes a little bit sometimes more sort of easy to cite than some of this general term of bias. Like, we sort of see these microaggressions repeatedly often, right? And I'm not going to go through this entire list, but just taking, a few examples. You might receive this sort of microaggression, but take time, inquire. I'm curious, what makes you think that? Or what did you mean by that comment? Someone might ask you, oftentimes in the US, we get asked, oh, where are you from? It's like, okay, well, do you mean where did I grow up? Or, where, do I live now? Or the country that I'm originally from? Ask, what do they mean by that, right? I'm curious, or what makes you think that? You can also sort of, empower, What could we do differently? You know, let's say someone, you know, makes this sort of comment that, you know, sort of is almost, you know, sometimes people are sort of dogmatic in their sort of thinking, you know, well, what could you do differently? How would you approach this in a different manner? Reframe, you know, have you ever thought about it like this? Redirect, let's shift the conversation. You know, it sounds like you think, or paraphrase. And sometimes if you know, like I said, you might be in a situation that might make you take a step back and pause. You know, it's like, oh, did that person really say that? I was at a meet and greet one time with a number of professionals, mostly individuals from the NIH, which National Institutes of Health, in the United States, and that someone came up to me and you know, it's like, oh, the normal sort of meet and greet, you know, language. Oh, what do you do? What's your name? So, you know, I said, oh, you know, Marcus, I'm an assistant dean well, actually, I just said I'm an assistant dean at my institution. And they said, an assistant dean? You're young to be an assistant dean. So, you know, that again was this sort of, you know, and then, you know what they said? They said, an assistant dean of what? I said, well, an assistant dean of diversity and student life. And a number of other, you know, colleagues, we were all in a circle. They were like, why did I, like, did that person really just say that? So, you know, that could be an opportunity where, you know, you might kind of speak from, you know, your own experience and say, I felt, you know, a little taken aback when you asked, you know, me, an assistant dean of what, or when you made that particular comment. It impacted me because, you know, that's if you feel comfortable being able to sort of combat that bias or that microaggression. Some might even call that a micro assault. But again, these are sort of little tidbits, and I have, you know, references for where some of these papers come from, and I'm happy to share those after the talk. So, you know, I now want to shift a little bit in our remaining time. I think I have about 15 minutes to just talk a little bit about, you know, some of the challenges that I think might be affecting us. I say us because I think a lot of this population, many of us are coming from marginalized communities or marginalized groups. Sometimes we're doing, you know, international postdocs or, you know, working in different countries. We might not always be a part of this sort of majority group in the spaces that we're in. And sometimes that presents challenges, and you're actually more sometimes susceptible to various biases and microaggressions, and sometimes even, you know, racism, or just really lack of equity because of that. And it's no fault to your own, but, you know, I think not only does the environment have a responsibility to change, but, you know, there are ways in which we can think about how to persist and how to tackle that. So, you know, I became really interested, I think, in this sort of, you know, scenario, and I'll tell you why, because of all of the challenges that I was seeing in a lot of these marginalized groups. You know, everything from sort of racial bias and prejudice, discrimination, sexism, a lot of these sort of big, you know, bias things. But a lot of times, you know, other things too, you know, the more subtle things, microaggressions, and, you know, feeling sometimes isolated in a particular environment. And, you know, this aspect of tokenism. Maybe you're the only, you know, person of your identity, and they ask you to do everything. And, you know, sometimes it's known as this diversity tax or this minority tax, you know, because of, you know, your particular identity. You're asked to do all of the sort of service things or the diversity stuff, or, you know, the things related to international scholars or whatever the case may be, when you don't have to represent that entire identity, right? You don't have to be the president of that particular affinity group just because you identify with that. And it takes away energy. Even though you might be interested and passionate about those things, the reality is that not everyone is faced with those sort of challenges. So, you know, there are a lot of things that come up. I'll even point out this aspect of John Henryism, which may not be as common, but one particular scholar coined this notion of John Henryism based off of this story of John Henry, where it was this, you know, African-American railroad worker who would drive nails into the railroad back in, you know, early 1910s, 20s. And there was a machine that was created that could do it faster and better. But John Henry felt, he had to prove himself that he could outwork this machine, but he ended up outworking himself to death, right? So this notion of John Henryism is sometimes that, we think, especially if we come from this sort of marginalized group, that we almost have to work harder, work better, work faster, than our sort of counterparts in order to sort of prove ourselves that we're capable, we're competent, and we can achieve a particular, stance. And we don't want that to lead to death or, burnout or overworking ourselves. So, I think being aware of these sort of challenges is the first step, right? Awareness that they exist. And then thinking about how we not only change our environments, but in some sense, frankly, how we persist into that until we can usher in that sort of culture change. So, I, as a researcher, and this really probably started when I was a student, maybe even a postdoc, I was really interested in some of the challenges that again, marginalized groups are facing, particularly, underrepresented minorities in the United States, and the impact that has on career choice and career outcome. I was noticing that a lot of, my colleagues who were also coming from underrepresented groups were not sort of, inclined to stay into academia. I think many of us wanted to pursue faculty positions, but did not necessarily want all of what came with that. And I was really interested in exploring that a little bit further. And I kind of start on this comment from, at the time, Sally Rocky was the deputy director for extramural research at the NIH. And she used to run a blog called, I think, Rock Talk or something like that. It's a play on her name. And I remember she made this comment. I was quite surprised by the idea that the majority of our trainees do not end up in academia. So I really thought that, perhaps I should start there, because there's this sort of pipeline or expectation a lot of times, even though I think now we know a lot of people go off into a number of diverse careers, that people would go from this sort of training stage of a student to a postdoc. Almost the expectation was that you would stay in an academia or a faculty position. But the reality, today is that only, I was looking particularly within my field of the life sciences, only 8% of PhDs enter tenure track positions within 5 years. And 23% of PhDs, I think the latest data are around 23% of biomedical PhDs, which is my sort of personal field, enter tenure track positions. And if you look at the postdocs within the biomedical sciences, about 21%. And those come from a few published studies. So part of my own research was really hypothesizing that I think a significant number of postdocs begin their postdoc with aspirations of becoming a faculty member, pursuing academia, but may seek, maybe alternative careers or other careers. I don't even like the word alternative, because it makes it seem like, you have to, like, the academia is the sort of primary thing when people should be empowered to pursue whatever they want to. But for those who do want to pursue academia, why is it that they are seeking these other sort of alternative careers? And what are the factors that might differ between men and women, or underrepresented and non-underrepresented, particularly in the United States? What motivates these postdocs to sort of persist in research for those who do want to sort of stay on that path? So we designed a study. I'll only spend a few minutes just going through some of the details, but I think it's very relevant for this sort of talk about bias in STEM careers. So we designed a study, we called it UMark. It was about a 70-item study. We sent it to academic institutions, about 50 within the United States, and we got almost 1,400 respondents. We analyzed about 1,300 of those. Here's the essential breakdown. About 60% of our respondents were women, almost 40% male. There were a few who were non-binary. Some international students are scholars. These were actually, postdocs, international postdocs. About 45% were international, 53% were US citizens. About 14% were underrepresented minority, which is actually a little bit overrepresenting within this sample of the existence of underrepresented minority postdocs. And the average time to degree was about 5 years. Most people were with about 2 years within their postdocs, and some had done multiple postdocs. And what we found, we basically asked them this question: well, what career sector are you most interested in pursuing? About 2% were interested in a sort of non-science related career. 12% were interested in something science related, but not necessarily doing active research, in a laboratory or at the bench. About 28% were interested in an industry focused career or some other research intensive career. About 11% interested in a faculty position that was teaching intensive, so that focused primarily on teaching. And then about 48 or 50% close, of our respondents were interested in pursuing a research intensive faculty position. We looked at the prevalence of this, of the number of respondents across years, which tends to drop off for our particular sample, but I think is also sort of representative for the number of, the year you're in within postdocs. And we noticed that, certainly kind of by year 2 or 3, there was this dip. Most of the postdocs who were in their latter years had a much higher interest in pursuing, particularly an academic career. And I won't go through all of the details. Most of our sample came from really top, institutions. We looked at publication records for those who were academic bound versus non-academic bound. The short answer is that those who wanted to pursue academic research careers published more, and they published in higher journals, and they had a higher sort of first author publication rate. We even looked at those who, were extremely productive, those who, you think are, we looked at this sort of crude measure of productivity, who are publishing in top journals, who are putting out a lot of different papers. Maybe those are the ones that have an affinity to go towards academic positions. Well, not exactly, right? Even about 40% of the highest, the top quartile of those who published in the best journals and published the most papers, about 40% of them wanted to pursue other careers as well. So it's not just that this sort of publication leads to an interest in an academic career. And then we looked at the factors that affect that, your sort of interest in academia versus other things. Some of the factors that were influential for people were things like grant funding, their sort of perceived level of responsibility to the family, job prospects, financial security. Financial security was a big one. So 70% or 68% of the people who wanted to pursue a career outside of academia cited their sort of their sense of financial security as an influential factor for that decision, whereas only about 32% of those who wanted to pursue academia said that this was an influential factor. So these sort of characteristics really kind of helped us, determine mentorship is another sort of key piece. And then we were able to sort of codify the most influential factors for each sort of decision. And we also even looked at things that these sort of measures of aspects of like self-worth and self-efficacy and how much that played into it as well. Turns out that if you have a lot of high self-worth, if you feel that you're valuable to your field, that you have a big impact to make, that you have this sort of high self-worth, that was a huge predictor for you wanting to go off to an academic career. And something like financial security was a big sort of negative predictor. But we also see aspects of like career mentorship and the funding climate and these other things that seem to play somewhat of a role as well. What was interesting is that it's almost the opposite for those who want to go off to industry. If you are more concerned about financial security as an influential factor in your career decision, the more likely you are to choose to go off to and want to pursue a career in industry. And then, let's say non-science related, your sort of self-worth was on the other side of the equation. But we wanted to know, how does this differ between different groups, maybe between genders or between, minority, non-minority? We looked at international status as well. We basically asked the same sort of questions. If you're an international student, what's the career that you're most likely to pursue? not much of a difference, about a difference of 4 percentage points as far as research intensive. Less international postdocs wanted to go into a teaching career. More might have wanted to pursue an industry career, but everything else seems to be about the same. We also looked at well-represented versus underrepresented. So if you underrepresented, you identify as Native American, African American, Hispanic within the United States. And this also includes some international scholars. Our underrepresented minority males, for example, which are in the yellow bars, had this sort of affinity for non-research and non-science related careers a little bit higher than their counterparts. And this was, seen to be significant. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the other details. What I'll say is that for a lot of women and underrepresented minorities, they made the decision about whether they wanted to stick with an academic career largely by the end of year 2. Most of them sort of, dropped out between years 1 and 2 of their postdoc. And if they stuck around, then seemed like they wanted to sort of try their hand at a sort of faculty position. But that wasn't the case for a lot of well-represented males. So those individuals who identified as white and male, they didn't make their sort of decision in years 1 and 2. They largely kind of stayed flat as far as their interest in pursuing academia, which you largely kind of see, from this graph. We looked also at outcome expectations and self-efficacy. I don't have a lot of time to explain on what that means, but we found that women, as far as their expectations about their careers and their self-efficacy, were reportedly lower than a lot of males. We did focus groups and follow-ups with this, and it wasn't because they didn't feel as if they could achieve a research position. It was largely their bias that they felt within certain systems within science. So in grant funding, right? Who receives the grants? They felt that there were bias within that, right? Who gets publications in top journals? It's not, again, that they didn't feel like they had the self-efficacy. They felt that there were bias within those systems that ultimately affected their sort of confidence in their ability to publish in top journals or to get grants like their male counterparts. And we found that there were interesting differences for underrepresented minorities as well, and that their self-efficacy was actually a little bit higher, despite the fact that they actually published a little bit less underrepresented minority postdocs than their counterparts, well represented. We also looked at the publication record of international scholars as well. They published really significantly a little bit more than their domestic scholars. Again, maybe this idea of having to work a little bit harder because you're in a particular space. So now you're seeing how bias and these other sort of factors and challenges are actually playing out in terms of behaviors and outcomes for careers. So this is, again, evidence that some of these things are having an effect on our sort of professional lives and sometimes our professional decisions. I don't have time to go into some of the details, but we do have a published paper on it. We also asked people about the advice that they would give to others pursuing this sort of research path. Again, the top sort of characteristics that came out, passion, hard work, self-reflection, mentorship. A lot of these things, are excellent, but they're not necessarily, getting a certain threshold of published papers or getting, a certain number of grants. These are all things that are very subjective and have an opportunity where bias can creep in. So again, we have to be the first step is awareness, right? And then, we asked people, we did these focus groups about, what are some of the factors that you believe are affecting, your career decisions. Sometimes people acknowledge being a parent or, their sense of financial security, all these other life choices, these things that are come about because of our diversity that will ultimately sometimes affect our career decision. It's not just the number of publications and the number of grants or which lab you joined. It's these other factors too that make us who we are, that ultimately sometimes affect, which career we go into. Sometimes it's this lack of flexibility of where you want to work. Maybe I can only work in the States, or maybe I can only stay in Europe or certain aspects. this quote I thought was, meaningful, and it sort of summed up the advice that I think people had. It basically said that being a successful academic research is akin to almost pursuing a career in performance music, professional sports. Science and research must be your real passion, which you must be willing to work extremely hard and sacrifice for. And even if you work hard and sacrifice, of course, even at sort of the requisite level of talent, you may not make it to the big leagues. You may not make it to, the NBA or the professional sports, but in some sense, if you're willing to take that risk and you enjoy the journey, it's okay, right? Try your hand at it. And that was largely, I think, the sort of summary. But again, I just, wanted to sort of remind us that, if we are to really create environments that are truly diverse and truly inclusive, we have to be sort of conscious about the sort of biases, the challenges that everybody is facing, no matter who you are. So, again, I have, some strategies about how we might be able to change the scientific workforce. Hope that I can be able to share these in more detail, maybe after the talk. The last thing I really want to leave you with is some takeaway messages, some takeaway tools. What are the tools that I can use to try to challenge biases? Perspective taking. So take time to take the perspective of someone else, right? Even though, let's say you might be the recipient of bias, or you might be the witness of it. Maybe you're the culprit, right? Take time to take another person's perspective. Understand how they see things. Also, stereotype replacement, right? Again, sometimes we have this sort of tendency to assign people to sort of, stereotypes, right? Try to replace that stereotype with something else. Again, counter stereotype imaging, right? You might see, a particular person, you might think of them in a certain way. Think about another example of that person who might be, a counter stereotype to what you might be thinking about. And again, let's not generalize. Let's treat people as individuals. Try to get to know people for who they are and not their identity. And then increase, at the last, thing I'll leave you with is increase opportunity for contact. And I know that might be a little bit challenging, this sort of world of this pandemic, this virtual world, but that's why you're on the STEMPeers symposium. That's why you're connected. That's why you have this opportunity to engage with other people. So use that opportunity to get to know people, disrupt those sort of biases and those natural assumptions that you may have, and I guarantee you will be much better off. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the time to speak with you. It's been a pleasure. Happy to sort of take any questions in any sort of format.
Thank you, Marcus. That was really enlightening. Of course, we as a group, we observe these biases happening across the board, and we rarely focus on them because we just assume that life is going to be this way, and there is no way out. But definitely there is a way out. As we saw from your talk, there is a way out to change the way we work in a STEM career or in daily lives, and we can really make a difference in incremental amounts, which can bring about a big change later on. So I think there were so many things to take away from your talk. I think one of the points on John Henryism that you highlighted is a very valid point for international postdocs and grad students. We really tend to overwork, burn out ourselves to really outperform our colleagues and say that yes, we are better, and we can do even better if we are asked to. And actually that leads to a lot of frustration and mental health issues in our community. And like we have seen, many people over the past 5 years have expressed anonymous messages to us that I'm going through this, and I really cannot take it. I want a way out. I had thought I wanted to go to academia, but it's simply not working out. And no matter how much I do, it is just an uphill battle that I keep on climbing, no end to it. I think Tracy has been watching, and she gave some couple of comments. I just want to read it out. She said that, thank you for an amazing talk. The discussion on disrupting microaggressions was particularly actionable. And I think the study results and biases that creep in are so valuable to know. So that is, I think, one of the she has been like very supportive of our group, and she has been a part of our mentor mentee program also as an executive coach. So that coming from her is a very valuable point. um, um, Shohini, do you have any questions?
Yes, I had one question, which is more of like to know what your suggestion would be. You made a point where you want to have a conversation with somebody, like you had those interrupt and talked about ways to have a conversation with the other person. So my point is, how I'm talking about this from the other side. So how do you have a conversation with somebody and say that, hey, like this is something you think about, let's say, maybe it's a slightly sexist comment or a racist comment. But their reply is going to be, but we are consciously not. Like let's say even for I respect women, but they made this comment. How do you tell them that, hey, we know you're consciously probably not, but there's that disconnect between the unconscious and the conscious thinking. And as you mentioned, that unconscious thinking is 90% of it. So how to have a conversation in that case? How do you, in a very, without demeaning that person or without disrespecting that person, bringing that point to their notice that it's not, probably it is unconscious, so how can somebody work on it, or just making them more aware of it? How does that work?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very good point. You know, one of the things I think that's natural to humans, you know, we almost have this sort of defensive nature. We have this sort of natural aversion to being attacked, or feeling as if we're attacked, or feeling as if we've done something wrong. You know, it takes a lot of, you know, humility to sort of empathize and listen to the other person, even though, you know, you have, again, this sort of, here are my defined beliefs as a person, right? I don't want to be sexist. I want to be fair, right? Like, I'm a fair human being. So to have someone point out to you something that seems to kind of combat that, it's a natural sort of aversion that you might have. So, you know, my recommendation is not sort of, you know, put it in the context of, you know, of that, if you will, you know, almost put it in the context of, this is how I felt, this is how it made me feel as a person. You know, like, let's say, you know, someone makes this sort of comment, and instead of saying, hey, you know, I think this is a sexist comment, or this is gender bias, you know, and you did that, and you did this, say, you know, I the way I saw this is, you know, it was actually hurtful for me as an individual, not necessarily in terms of gender, just me as an individual, right? And it made me feel this way, and it made me feel that way. And I think people tend to sort of empathize a little bit better with that. And then sometimes will realize, and usually, and sometimes, again, people don't want to be labeled in these particular ways, but if you have a sort of natural conversation with them, oftentimes I've experienced this with individuals within my academic space. I don't, you know, come to them as a diversity officer and say, hey, you've violated this particular rule. And, you know, I will often sit down with people and have, you know, like a coffee chat and say, hey, you know, you remember when you gave that talk, there were some students who, you know, they didn't, when you said that particular line, like they were a little taken aback by it. And, you know, so it's about the approach. But I will also say, this is where allyship is really good, because it's not always on the burden of in some sense, the victim or the you know, the complainant to, you know, always combat these things. If you are a witness, right? You know, I've been in meetings where, you know, there's been mansplaining, which, you know, sometimes the men kind of overtalk the women or say something, you know, in a different way, but my female colleague just said that. Sometimes I'll try to make a point and say, acknowledge, yeah, you know, so-and-so made this particular point just a minute ago, or she acknowledged that, and I appreciate the way she said that. You know, again, these ideas of micro affirmations. But even if it's not in that particular setting, you know, there's this idea of allyship, where sometimes if you don't even, you know, there was one particular professor who, you know, I saw an email, they made a particular comment about a particular person that, you know, my other colleague and I, we were like, what, did this person really say that? And then the person even acknowledged in the email that, hey, I know I'm not supposed to be saying that, but that's who I am. I'm a jokey sort of person. And, I know I offend a lot of people. That still doesn't make it okay, So I think, even as allies, even if the person never will even know about it, sometimes we have a responsibility. So the way I addressed it, I didn't sort of, because the person acknowledged, yes, they probably shouldn't have said that, but the fact that they still sent that email is problematic. So I let them know that, like, hey, that was wrong, in a sort of joking matter as well, just to let them in some sense not get away with that, right? And then again, there might be a better opportunity to address it, down the line or something. But I recognize that sometimes we're facing these sort of situations where there are tough decisions, right? There might be social capital involved. There might be, power dynamics. You might not want to offend a particular, professor or your colleague because you have to collaborate with them later, or they might be controlling your salary, whatever the case may be. So you have to be nuanced about this. And if you often don't know the exact sort of way to approach it, get advice. Take a moment, step back. You can still come back and tell someone, hey, you remember when we had that conversation yesterday? It's just been on my mind sort of heavy, and I just wanted to let you know that it kind of, disturbed me a little bit, right? And there's still an opportunity to have that conversation, even if it's later. So I hope that's a little helpful.
No, that is, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Marcus, I just want to add one more question, and it stems from what we discussed between you and Shohini. It's about cultural assimilation for international students and postdocs. So you might already have seen, like, our community is dominated by South Asians who have migrated to US and Europe and different parts of the world for scientific careers. And they, of course, when they move out of South Asia, they really end up in a very white dominated population, most of these Western countries. So how can they really get well educated before they take that migration step? Because it is not a part of a common curriculum about the culture in the Western nations and how things should be consciously not be ignored. And most of us definitely do not take these things seriously, and we should be better educated at it. So do you have any suggestions for our community who are moving or plan to move?
Yeah, it's really a point. I do have a couple suggestions. I think there are obviously a wealth of resources online, but that's, I think that's if you want to know deeper and more, right? I think sometimes if you're sort of coming into a new space or a new environment, sometimes the best thing you can do is find an affinity group or find other people who are like you and who have shared experiences. And maybe that, might not be exactly like yourself or exactly like the sort of way you identify. Maybe they might not be exactly from the same country, but they have had sort of similar experiences, and they can sort of help you understand the sort of culture, the sort of values that might be present in a particular space. And then, I think it's not always on the burden of the person. I think sometimes we take, especially those who come from us who come from various, underrepresented groups or marginalized groups, we think that we have this sort of burden of assimilating in a particular culture, in a particular space, because those normative values are what they are. We are very much a part of creating those normative values as anyone else, right? So don't hesitate to bring your whole self to that particular environment, right? Like, be yourself, right? Enjoy what you enjoy. It's the responsibility of the institution and the culture and the people to welcome you and to help you be a part of that space. I remember going to this sort of academic conference when I was a graduate student, and one of few sort of minorities. This conference was probably my first academic conference as a student. So, I'm ready. Like, obviously research-wise, I was ready, and I ended up giving a talk, but sort of culturally, I wasn't ready. So I came, like dressed up, in a suit. I didn't wear a suit, but I definitely had a tie, real dressed up. sharp. I even had dry cleaned my clothes, and I was ready to make this really good impression on all of these sort of scientists. I basically missed the memo that this was like a dress down sort of conference. Like, so all of the PIs are in like Hawaiian shirts, dressed down with shorts and tennis shoes. Like, I had never seen these guys like wearing like, sneakers and just like real dressed down clothing. So I was, of course, the oddball, thinking that I'm trying to like assimilate in this group by like wearing a shirt and tie. So, just be yourself, and, obviously find people who are, like-minded, who have kind of similar experiences to help you in that sort of cultural assimilation. But be comfortable being yourself. Is not your responsibility for managing everybody else's biases.
Thank you. Yeah, there is one last question from Tracy. Shoini, do we have time?
We have 5 minutes, or like
okay.
A couple minutes actually, to be honest.
All right, I'll just read it out. Tracy said, because your study showed the time for impact of coaching, mentoring, resilience building for women and minorities is during first 2 years. What are your recommendations to create an environment of this at universities, admin, faculty, to improve the pipeline?
Yeah, the reality is that I know for sure a lot of American universities do a very poor job of support at the postdoctoral stage. In terms of, I think we've known for a long time that this idea of, only having one mentor or one sort of PI, is not practical, and it's not the best for ensuring, success. You really need multiple mentors. You need support. You need peer mentorship. You need others, to help, coach you and sponsor you and all of this thing. And, we've sort of codified ways to sort of enhance the pipeline at various levels, at the undergraduate level, even at the graduate level. There are initiatives. I'm the PI of this grant called IMSD, which helps to support diversity in the biomedical sciences. There are training grants that we have, that are really shining more of a light on this. But, sometimes when it comes to the postdoctoral level, it's like, okay, bye, good luck. And, there's this sort of isolation. So, I think for institutions, they have to think about the ways in which they're supporting postdocs, especially if we're going to increase diversity at the faculty level. I mean, that's the step before faculty, right? And we're losing good talent at that level in terms of, our goal of, enhancing this sort of pipeline. So I think institutions have a lot to do. I think postdocs can also probably, as students and postdocs have always done, in some sense, begin to take these things into their own hands, right? Not only are there new sort of grants, that might help, Mosaic and others that might help. But I think if you aren't noticing that you're getting the sort of well-rounded mentorship that you need, let's go out and be strategic, intentional about getting that and establishing that. There was a postdoc who works at my institution who noticed that, he basically needed sort of more peer support. He established, this sort of, postdoc and junior faculty instructor sort of group. And they met like, monthly just to talk about like their projects. And many of them were going for K awards and, these other sort of fellowships and grants. So they did that together, and together they're rising and lifting each other up. So, I think if you aren't feeling like you have that sort of, mentorship to advance yourself in your career, create that for yourself. And then sort of nudge your institution, those who are in positions like myself, to take, more responsibility, be a voice, for others if you feel like you can.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marcus. I think we are running out of time, but this was an amazing talk and totally worth the time that we all are spending from across the globe. And to our audience, stay tuned for the next talk coming up at 11. And hope you enjoyed Marcus's talk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send it to us at STEMPeers@gmail.com, or connect with Marcus directly on LinkedIn. He is open to networking. So we look forward to your participation, and thank you, Marcus. And I know today we have Halloween, so there will be a bias in distributing candy, so I have to be conscious of that. So take care, Marcus, and
All right.
see you soon
Thank you
sometime.
so much.
Yeah.